So I think we can start. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this semester's HCIAS Wednesday Colloquium. My name is Judith Müller. I'm a postdoc at the HCIAS, and I would like to welcome you all to this colloquium, also on behalf of my colleague Yatzil Guevara Gonzalez, who cannot be here today. Our first guest this semester is Maria Polinsky from the University of Maryland. We are very happy to have you here today. Thank you for coming. And I would like to introduce you shortly to Maria. She holds a professorship in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Maryland. She has done extensive work on endangered languages around the world, and her main fields of concern are heritage languages and their bearing on linguistic theory, syntactic theory, and language universals, as well as the range of cross-linguistic variation. One of her major contributions is bringing the tools and research questions of lab-based psycholinguistics to speakers of understudied languages, including Mayan languages in Guatemala. She has published many articles and books, as well as edited many collections. Most recently, the book Formal Approaches to Complexity in Heritage Language Grammars, which was published last year, and the Cambridge Handbook of Comparative Syntax, which is in press right now. We will have like 45 minutes of presentation now, and then we have plenty of time for Q&A, around 45 minutes as well. And I will let you know when there are 10 minutes left to speak. So now the floor is yours. Looking forward to your speech.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me, and particularly many thanks to my many hosts, Hector and Professor Tracy, who's here, who has been taking good care of me. And I'm also glad to see some colleagues from the program called RUG, and I would encourage you to talk to them as well. So thanks very much for having me here. I'm going to talk about structural parallels between heritage and endangered languages, but I know that not everybody here is a linguist, so I'll try to make it as linguistics light as possible. So we'll start with some definitions. If I'm going to show you something you already know, just bear with me. So a heritage language is something that's learned at home in a naturalistic context, not in a room, in a classroom, and it typically corresponds to a minority language in a larger national society. So for example, here in Germany, the dominant language will be German, and then lots of different heritage languages could be anything from Spanish to English. So you have a variety of different languages spoken in the home, some larger, some smaller. We usually recognize two subtypes of heritage languages. The heritage language of simultaneous bilingual. So let's say a child is growing up in Germany. One parent speaks German, which is also the dominant language of the society. The other parent speaks Spanish. Spanish is going to be a little weaker, but it will be the language, another language that this child will learn from scratch. But we also recognize that heritage languages can be sequential, whereas the heritage, the home language arrives first, and then the dominant language arrives later, and we usually cut it off at 5, because by 5 we normally have a fully acquired linguistic system. So if someone moves to a new country before age 5, they're likely to be a heritage speaker of the language that they spoke in their homeland. Now, heritage language speakers do not have to be super fluent. So that's an important consideration. So heritage language speakers are those who grew up hearing language X and possibly, but not necessarily speaking it. And as adults, they can probably understand and perhaps, but not necessarily speak that language to some degree, but they're much more comfortable in another language. And especially if it comes to their educational or professional domain where they feel more comfortable in the dominant language. And I'm sure everybody in this audience can relate to that, either themselves is a heritage language speaker or knows someone who's a heritage language speaker? Actually, let's do a show of hands. How many people here are heritage speakers? Okay, so we have quite a few. So that's the definition of a heritage speaker. Heritage speakers are often very reluctant to speak because they're mocked about how they speak, or they feel, oh, I don't know everything. How dare I open my mouth? And that kind of relates to this general problem. So we have lots of people around us, lots of bilinguals, lots of heritage speakers, and we sometimes take them for granted. And until very recently, that was taken for granted in the educational system, where the idea was, okay, well, you learned some Spanish in school, at home, excuse me. Okay, go to the Spanish class, and sit down with someone who doesn't even know how to say el jardín, and everyone will be happy together. So this was kind of the initial idea, and we still take a lot of bilingualism for granted and don't quite know what to do. Now let's talk about endangered languages. An endangered language is something that is not passed on to the next generation, and it's often limited to specific contexts or domains. And here's just one example. I don't know how to get rid of this thing on top. Oh, no, I can't. Yes, I can. Okay, so this is a profile of someone who was the last speaker of the language called Ayak, which is spoken in Alaska. So Mary Smith Jones, you can see she lived a very long life. She died, she was the last full-blooded Ayak, and with her the language died. But imagine that when she was the last speaker of Ayak, who did she speak Ayak to? Mostly to herself. So this is your profile of an endangered language, which often ends up with language death. Okay, now I did something wrong and my screen doesn't move. Okay, so an endangered language speaker is someone who has few or no people to talk to. And a lot of these endangered language speakers are old, and we value them the way you would value an antique vase at your house, trying not to break it, thinking that it's very fragile. So you can see the contrast between those bilinguals that we take for granted and those endangered language speakers that we think of as very special, and they are special. So the question then is it worth a lot or is it not worth anything? And so what is the commonality between bilingual speakers who roam around in droves and those frail old speakers like Mary Jones of disappearing languages? What do these two groups of people have in common? And so what I want to do today is to actually show you that they have a lot in common. I'll try to relate the two fields that unfortunately don't talk to each other very often. I will show some of my main takeaway points. And because I'm a linguist, I will spend a little time torturing you talking about linguistics. We'll talk about core factors that lead to special grammars in heritage languages and endangered languages. And this is where you will see that the languages are very similarly built. We'll talk, if I have time, I'll talk a little bit about methodology and then go to my conclusions. So let's try to relate those opposites that should attract the two fields that seldom talk to each other. So as I just said, the heritage language is a minority language that's learned naturalistically by speakers who are children, and it coexists with a societally dominant language. Now, if you look at the definition of an endangered language, it's exactly the same. It's a minority language, which was learned by these people as children, which coexists with a societally dominant language to which these people are shifting, and which is at risk of disappearing because these people are not talking to anyone and there's no homeland. That's the big difference between heritage and endangered languages. So just like heritage speakers, endangered language speakers sometimes never speak the language. They just hear it around themselves. And that's what we call overhearers. So this is the definition of speakers who just have passive control of the language. And often you talk to someone and you can say, well, I think this person is not a good speaker of language X. So we kind of know it when we see it. We think of these speakers as having some kind of native speakerhood, but they're different from monolinguals. They're different from educated people, but are also different from bilinguals. So let's say Spanish heritage speaker is going to be different from someone who learned Spanish in the classroom. So we have this vagueness of, we also have an abundance of terminology. So if you look at the terminology about heritage speakers and endangered speakers, you see a lot. So we have things like ethnic language, minority language, ancestor language, non-official language, minoritized languages. For a while, people called heritage languages incompletely acquired. Until recently, they were called semi-speakers. But you don't want to come up to someone and say, hey, you're a semi-speaker of Spanish. So it's a little unpleasant. Endangered languages are also covered by a bunch of terms. So we have such terms as shifting languages, minoritized languages, silent, sleeping, or dormant languages, abandoned languages. We have obsolescence, and we talk about semi-speakers. You see that there is also a little bit of an overlap in terminology. And so the question is, why we talk about that in such a way? And I want to bring to your attention this wonderful book, which is very old by now. It's like over 40 years old. The book by Nancy Doran called Language Death, where she took a look at a Gaelic language spoken by fishermen who were all switching to English. And she was very honest. She called it language death. But, you know, we are very uncomfortable talking about death or loss. And that's why our society has developed so many euphemisms. And generally, you have this kind of negative conception of loss. And so when we have this terminological richness, when we talk about language abandonment or language obsolescence, that might be a way of dealing with guilt or fear or some kind of helplessness. So there is an interesting social dimension to this perpetuation of terminology. So if we say that something is in danger, then we kind of intimate that there is a species that needs to be saved. And we have a sense of loss and instability. When we talk about the language as heritage, there is a sense of this cherished possession and sense of stability. And this is where it's misleading, because both types of languages are not very stable, and they can be improved or relearned, but that requires a lot of work, and that requires a lot of support from the society. So there are three ways we can compare these languages by, and this goes back to the work by a very prominent German linguist, Hans-Jürgen Sasse. He passed away several years ago, but he has a wonderful paper about language death. And he talks about 3 points of comparisons of these languages: the external setting, the community setting, and the internal properties of these languages. So the external setting is a set of extra linguistic pressures that limit the use of a particular language. So what is it that didn't allow Mary Jones to speak a yak? Obviously, there was nobody else to talk to. What are the community patterns? When there are several speakers of a yak, where do they speak it? Do they speak it in church? Do they speak it in the workplace? What are the patterns of behavior? And then what are the structural signs of endangerment? This is something that I will talk about more today. So when we define the external setting, we basically talk about the language competition, where we have language A, which is learned at home or is somehow available to young children, but at the same time, it's not the dominant language of the larger society, or not a dominant language of the larger society, depending on how many languages you have. And then a language community is a compact language unit, which may or may not be available. Again, go back to the Ayak example. There were no Ayak speakers by the time this old lady died, so her language community had the N of 1. Not all endangered languages are heritage languages. There could be abrupt loss, and we know a lot of cases where, let's say, speakers of a particular language were forcibly migrated, and that led to abrupt loss. Or like in the case of Tasmania, when Tasmania was colonized, pretty much every Tasmanian speaker was killed. So that's another way of killing a language, which we don't recommend. But unfortunately, there are cases of abrupt loss. But what I want to show you is some differences in the external setting between heritage and endangered languages. So in terms of the homeland, that's the most important difference. A lot of heritage languages have a homeland. We talk about Spanish in Germany, but Spanish is also spoken in Spain and a lot of countries in Latin America. There is Korean spoken in France. There's a very large Korean community in France, but if they all stop speaking Korean tomorrow, Korean won't disappear because there is a homeland. For endangered languages, there's no homeland. They are immigrants in their own country. If a yak goes away with the speaker, then there's no place where it's spoken. For heritage languages, because there is homeland, there's often a standard language. There is typically an available baseline or even a standard, which is something that people learn at school. No such thing is available to endangered language speakers. And typically we talk about traditional languages, which are often just preserved as some texts. In terms of compact community, heritage speakers are often scattered all over the place. For example, I had a subject who was the only Polish speaker in Texas, in a small town in Texas. So she had no one to talk to, but there are other Polish speakers, and now with the internet, of course, the issue is not so difficult. But for endangered languages communities, if they are still there, are typically compact and available. For endangered languages, language is a very important indicator of cultural affinity, something that heritage speakers often lack. For endangered language speakers, it's very important that they speak right, and speak right means speak the traditional language. For heritage speakers, it's not very important, although they're very self-conscious. And then we know from historical records that speaking endangered languages was often persecuted. Think about cases of Australian Aborigines who were not allowed to speak the languages, North American, Native American languages. In heritage languages, a lot of heritage speakers are actually embarrassed as teenagers when they go out with their parents and they hear the parents speaking the home language, right? As they grow up, that things get better, but there is no persecution for speaking. So you see that the external setting is extremely varied. But what's important for my purposes is that there is this difference in the availability of the baseline, which we have for the heritage speakers and we don't have for endangered. Now, talking about community patterns, let's examine some speech behavior that follow from the extralinguistic pressures. And what we see is that there's a lot of overlap. So I showed you a huge difference between external pressures. But now as we move to community patterns, we see that both heritage languages and endangered languages show significant variance, from some people who are very fluent to people who can barely say, Mom, I need 20 euros. And that's essentially what they use the language for. There is a lot of reduction in register and use. We see that in both types of languages. There is very low confidence in one's linguistic ability. Again, this is where the languages overlap. More proficient speakers like to code switch, and we have a lot of linguistic research on code switching. And if you look at the intergenerational transmission, it's not present for endangered languages, neither is it present for heritage languages. Very few heritage speakers raise their children as heritage speakers of the home language. This is changing now, but it's a very slow change. So once we moved from extra-linguistic pressures to community pressures, we see a huge overlap. And what I want to do now is ask this question: what are the structural signs of endangerment? Now that we know that there is some overlap, can we look at these languages and just by looking at how they're built, say, okay, these languages are heritage or endangered? And the reason it's so important is that, as I just said, we don't have the baseline for endangered languages. So if we know how heritage languages are built, that would allow us to understand how the grammar of an endangered language may differ from traditional language grammars. So that will be a way of restoring the missing link. So understanding heritage languages, therefore, would allow us to predict structural property of endangered languages, even when we don't know what the baseline is. So these are the reasons to connect these two fields. And the main takeaway points are that internal grammars, internal structure of heritage and endangered languages are always consistent, always coherent. They're not built as random chunks. And it's not all about making things simpler, although we often look at languages and so, heritage Danish is simpler than Danish, but that's not all about simplification. And the important thing is change is not random. as we look at heritage and endangered languages, it's also very important to keep in mind that we don't want to just do mass surveys because there is so much variance. And so there is tremendous value in looking at individual speakers and shifting languages and understanding how their language is built. So in terms of coherence, the important point is that a speaker of a heritage language or an endangered language controls a coherent and systematic internal grammar. By internal grammar, I mean this abstract knowledge that allows to create hierarchical structure from new segments and to analyze what we hear, to analyze infinite number of new segments. So that's what we call internal segments. So to present that graphically, people often think that you have this collection of ruins of an endangered or heritage language. But in fact, what you have is a very well-built, well-structured system. So it's a coherent system. The problem is that the system may be different from what we know from the baseline. Heritage, heritage Polish spoken in Germany will be different from Polish spoken in Poland. And it's our job as linguists or language scientists to understand how the heritage language or the endangered language diverges from the traditional or baseline grammar. Okay. So in terms of divergences, we don't expect differences across the board. We expect essentially three scenarios. One is there is no divergence. So just like a regular language, heritage language or endangered language is acquired, everything is fine, and the speakers are about the same. And that has been documented for a number of heritage languages like Portuguese or Polish. Another possibility is that divergence may just be an illusion, and that one is due to processing limitations, because people who speak an endangered language or heritage language do not have a lot of experience and do not have a lot of time speaking these languages, and as a result, they do a lot of false starts, they make mistakes, but that does not mean that their underlying grammar, their underlying representations are faulty. And then the third case, the most interesting one, is when there is true divergence. And so the question is, can we predict that? And again, if we understand the grammatical pressures that allow us to predict divergences, then we can also understand the way endangered languages are built. And so what I want to do now is to talk about three core factors which can actually change the grammar of a heritage language or an endangered language and lead to shared structural properties. So these core factors are perceptual salience, establishment of regular patterns, and minimization of domains. And I apologize if that sounds scary, but I'll try to explain that as much as I can. So here's perceptual salience. The idea is that salience is defined through perceptual criteria. We hear something very well. It could be stressed. It could be part of a big syllable. It could be large chunk of segment. It could be sonority. So for example, L is perceptually more salient than H. O is more perceptually salient than P. Pa is more perceptually salient than A, and so on. So that's just a very, very simple definition of perceptual salience. And if a language has two or more forms for expressing concept X, then the one which is more salient will be preserved in the heritage or endangered language, and the one that's less salient will be lost. So if you look at French, for example, French has heavy and light pronouns. So for the first person, you can say moi or je. If you look at Creoles based on French, all their first person pronouns are based on moi. Je doesn't survive. If you have an overt form and the absence of a form, then you often have this impression of redundancy that we see both in heritage languages and in endangered languages. If you have only one encoding option, if you don't have a contrast like between moi and je, then if that option is perceptually light, it's likely to be ignored. So let me show you a very familiar case, and that's the case from differential object marking, or for Spanish speakers, a personal. In Spanish, as all of you know, if we have an object which is a person or a definite pronoun, you have to use a. So you have to say a Jorge. But if you have an indefinite object, here a before un árbol is not necessary or ungrammatical. So the question is, what happens in heritage Spanish And before I show you what happens in Heritage Spanish, I want to bring up the same marker in Romanian. So in Romanian, a personal is pe. So the Romanian marker is pe. And what we find is that in Heritage Spanish, a personal disappears. So heritage speakers of Spanish forget to say veo a Jorge, they just say veo Jorge. Whereas heritage Romanian speakers start using pe all over the place. It becomes a general marker of objects in heritage Romanian. And so the grammar of these two markers, a and pe, is extremely similar. But in Spanish, you can barely hear it. And imagine if a precedes a noun, which also starts with a, veo Andres, then you don't hear it at all. And so the lack of salience leads to the disappearance of a personal in heritage Spanish, but the stronger salience of pe leads to its generalization of an object marker in heritage Romanian. So heritage speakers of Romanian now use pe even if they want to say, I saw a train, I saw a tree. So pe will start appearing. So this is where we have two very similar grammars, and the difference lies in this perceptual salience. And perceptually salient markers of differential objects become general object markers. We see the same kind of development in some endangered languages. So for example, Palauan, a language spoken in the Pacific, which is severely endangered, basically replaced by English. There's a marker R, which you can hear very well. And that marker was used as a personal in traditional Palauan. Now it becomes a general object marker. Some Amerindian languages, the marker re, which is again very visible, starts out as the Spanish a personal, but then later emerges as this generalized object. So we see that this kind of dependence on perceptual salience becomes a driving force in changing the grammar in a particular way. The second thing I want to show very briefly is how we develop regular domains. I wanted to have two examples, but I'll just talk about one, food structure in Sami. So what's a food? A food is a grouping of syllables within a word. And you can have one syllable, which becomes a food. You can have two syllables. You can also have three syllables. So it's just a concept where it's a way we group syllables. And feet can be divided into unary, where you just have one syllable, or binary. And they can also be divided into archaic, where the stress falls on the first syllable, and iambic, where the stress falls on the second syllable. So what we have in the language called Pita Sami, which is a language in Finland, it's a very endangered language. Pita Sami, unlike the traditional Sami, no longer has feet, which consist of one syllable. So all the syllables have become regular, the feet have become regular. They're all two syllables. Morphemes always begin with feet, and you always go left to right, which is not necessary. In some natural languages, you go right to left. And what's important is, as you can see from this example, which I will try to read, Vasya lis vuohta, the food boundary is inside vuohta, which is basically a whole morpheme. And so that means that this visibility of feet is extremely important. And another thing that we find in Pita Sami is that the feet are all trochaic. The stress is on the first syllable. So it'll be something like Vasya lis vuohta. The use of trochaic feet is something we also find in child language, and it's indicative of what linguists call strong start, where the leftmost constituent of the intonational phrase should be prosodically salient. It shouldn't be prosodically deficient element. So we see that across different languages. And we also find that in Afro-Hispanic varieties, which develop the same kind of default pitch, the stress on the first syllable, and that's the accent that's widely used in all phrase positions, and it's found there in contrast to non-contact varieties of Spanish. So you have this kind of contact effect. And if you look across the world, what you see is, if you look at the map, the red dots, which you can see outnumber the blue dots, are trochaic feet. So trochaic feet are clearly preferred in natural language. And we see that this preference becomes almost a rule in endangered and endangered and heritage languages. For heritage languages, I've only shown you Afro-Hispanic varieties. For endangered languages, I've only shown you Pita Sami. And so our job is to see whether or not this rule holds. But if it holds, this shows that we're going through a pattern of serious regularization. And so as structural patterns become more regular, the overall system may be pushed towards default patterns. And so if what I show here is a default pattern, put your stress on the first syllable, then it's natural that in endangered and in heritage languages, we're going to this default pattern. And then non-default patterns may be eliminated, like they got eliminated in Sami. So of course, a big elephant in the room is what counts as default. That's something that linguists worry about a lot. And I don't think there is a consensus here, but we can always try to at least approach defaults by looking at the cross-linguistic distribution or child language. So the third factor, which makes endangered and heritage languages look alike and different from the baseline, is the factor of minimizing domains. So what I mean here is that if you have a particular grammatical operation that can apply to different structure sizes, then in a heritage language or an endangered language, you're going to use a smaller domain compared to the baseline. One example, which I didn't put on the slides, but I'll start with, has to do with vowel harmony. So some languages like Turkish have vowel harmony, and as Turkic languages become endangered, vowel harmony starts shortening. It no longer spreads over the entire word. It starts spreading just over the stem or over the root. And then the next step is you lose vowel harmony. So that's a minimization of domain. And the example I'm going to show is the example from grammar, where we're going to look at relative clauses, where I'm going to show you that shorter dependencies, again, are preferred or generalized in both heritage and endangered languages. The starting point is that pretty much every language has relative clauses. So we can say the man who was here yesterday, the book that I read. And some relative clauses are easier to form or to produce and process. And in particular, relative clauses which are about subjects, subject relative clauses, are easier to form and process than object relative clauses. So something like the man who bought the book is easier than the book that the man bought. So this is the contrast we're looking at. And linguists have sort of codified this asymmetry in the hierarchy, which is known as the Kinnan-Pomrey hierarchy. And we see that in child language acquisition, children start with subject relatives. We see that in heritage languages. What I want to show is that it also happens in endangered languages. So we'll start with heritage Russian. It's a language which is not lacking a homeland. So Russian allows relative clauses with a number of positions on the accessibility hierarchy. And you can say something like the dog which chases the cat, or you can say the dog which the cat is chasing. You can see that the word order in both cases is the same. So what you have to pay attention to is that there is a different inflection on the word which. So in the first case, we have the nominative case. In the second case, we have the accusative case. And then we also have different cases on the cat. So here we have, in the first case, we have the cat in the accusative. In the second case, we have cat in the nominative. So otherwise, the word order is exactly the same. And so Russian speakers, when they see a picture like that and they hear, where's the dog that the cat is chasing, won't have any trouble finding the right picture. Okay, and I'm sure you have no trouble finding the right picture. So where's the dog that the cat is chasing, top or bottom? Good. So now when we look at controls and adults, what we see is that in Russian monolingual speakers, be they children or adults, they have no problem figuring out what the dog is doing to the cat and what the cat is doing to the dog. But if you look at the green column on the right, you can see that heritage adults actually have a lot of problems. So they can't figure out when they look at this picture, they often choose the wrong picture or they're a chance. And that means that it's really hard for them to identify object relative clauses. So what contributes to this difficulty? They don't notice case because case is not salient, it's not stressed. And so they no longer see the inflection on the word which or in the word cat. And as a result, they have to deploy some general strategy. What's the general strategy? Let me choose the shortest dependency. And the smaller domain is when your gap is in the subject position, and the larger domain is your gap is in the object position. So what they do is they just try to shorten the structural distance between the relative pronoun and the subject gap. And as a result, for them, all the relative clauses become subject relative. And then you ask, okay, how do they deal with that in real life? In real life, we rarely have ambiguity. And these people have very little ambiguity in their pragmatic discourse. But when you put them in the lab and test them, this is what you see. Okay, now if we look at languages, endangered languages, we find the same pattern. So far I've been able to find 3 languages: Yaqui, which is spoken in Arizona, only subject relatives; Roviana, which is a language in the Pacific, also only subject relative; and then the language I've worked on myself, Tahitian. There are very few Tahitian speakers left who are not heritage, and they only use subject relatives. So then the question is, okay, what do they do in all other cases? How do they say the cat that the dog is chasing? They will say something, there's a cat, the dog is chasing it. So the language always finds a way to do that. But the question is, can you use the same structural means? And the answer is no. So in the domains that cannot be minimized, heritage languages and endangered languages alike replace this gap by a resumptive pronoun or resumptive noun phrase. So if we look at heritage Romanian, which is again a language with a good homeland, have the child that the child for whom the shower warms up, and you can see that we have the child twice. We have the child, and then for whom warms up the shower for the child. So that's what the heritage speaker is going to do. So you'll have this extra redundancy, but they will then express what they need to do. Okay. Same happens in Tahitian. In the baseline Tahitian variant, if I want to say the parents gave the ball to the girl, I have, uhora temitu tiputi. If I form a relative clause in traditional Tahitian, I will say the ball that the parents gave to the girl, just like in English. But if I do it in heritage Tahitian, I have to use a resumptive pronoun. So I will have to say the ball that the parents gave it to the girl. So that's this resumptive pronoun that baseline speakers don't use, but heritage speakers will say that that's the only way to express that. So they are not allowing the gap. Okay, instead of relative clauses, sometimes people use nominalization, so I'm going to skip that. But basically what we learned from these results is that both heritage languages and endangered languages use smaller structures in which dependencies are established, and they try to eliminate silent elements in such dependencies. So everything has to be spelled out, because then you have everything there in a very clear way. So how about, how much time?
At least 10 minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to just make very short remarks on methodology because I think it's really important. So we started with the observation that heritage speakers and speakers of endangered languages have very varied performance. Some of them speak very well, some of them can barely speak. And because we have this varied performance and varied language experience, that's a major challenge for us as we try to do research on these languages, because who do I take as my sort of baseline in a different way? If I have just this one speaker of a yak, well, I'm in trouble because, I have to study her or nothing else. But if I have more than one speaker, we have to really look at everything that these speakers come from. And there are a lot of observations in the literature where people say, well, all you need to do is to have a corpus, or all you need to do is to run an experiment, or all you need to do is to do production. So the point I would like to emphasize is that it's really important that we collect data from all these quarters. We see what these people do in production. We collect their corpora, but we also try to run mini experiments with them if it's possible, particularly challenging with endangered languages because they are often older speakers and you're dealing with memory loss. You're dealing with attention problems, and you're also dealing with people who are not used to technology. We ran a lot of experiments in Guatemala, and the first time we went there, we brought laptops. And one of the revelations was that a lot of people in Guatemala did not have corrected vision. So we put someone in front of the laptop, but you couldn't really see anything. So we ended up creating a lot of pictures and just paper. So you have to adapt to certain circumstances. But it's important that there is no contradiction in using all the available sources of data and then trying to reconcile them in a qualitative way. And an approach to the analysis of both endangered and heritage languages is desirable when it centers at individual speakers. Because as I said, we have evidence that individual speakers have coherent grammars, but that doesn't mean that speaker A is going to have the same coherent grammar as speaker B. And so sometimes it might be better to look at 2 speakers in great detail than to look at 10 speakers and sort of see what they're doing. So we have to be prepared for variability, which is both common in shifting and in heritage languages. So as an example, which I'm not going to talk about in great detail, I want to present the work by my 2 students, Rodrigo Ranero, who's currently at UCLA, and Polinsky. They worked with Santiago Tsutujil, a very endangered language. So this is Doña Rosario, one of our few remaining consultants. You can see the beautiful hat, and Paulina is wearing the same hat. So they worked with 3 sisters who live in the same house. Each sister ended up having a different grammar. And so as a result, they had to develop very, very intricate means of understanding how each sister's grammar works, and then trying to reconcile those 3 grammars. But if they had not done that, then we would have arrived at one grammar, which was totally imaginary. And so it's really important to not always pull accessibility judgments across speakers, because that will obscure the grammar of individual speakers and also point to grammars that no one would possess. And as a result, we may get ecologically non-valid data. So in summary, I'm not saying we shouldn't do corpora. I'm not saying we shouldn't do studies. I just showed you a study of Russian heritage speakers, and we had very consistent results. But I also want to emphasize that those large quantitative studies should be complemented by approaches which emphasize individual systems, because that will be optimal for analyzing variation. And that would allow us to avoid obscuring attested internal grammars. So let me conclude. In conclusion, what I would like to say is that as we look at external conditions on heritage languages and endangered languages, we see a lot of difference. We might see some differences in associated social behaviors, but in terms of structural correlates, shifting languages and bilingual languages are strikingly consistent, and they're all subject to the same set of pressures. If this is on the right track, then we can use heritage languages which have an established baseline as a parallel or a template for those languages that lack the baseline. So we can take, let's say, heritage Inuktitut, compare it to Inuktitut that's still spoken traditionally, and then use the comparison to figure out how a Yacht may have looked like when Mary Jones was not the only speaker of that language. As I suggested, although I didn't have time to show you all the details, heritage speakers and endangered language speakers all follow coherent grammatical patterns. Their system may differ from the baseline, but it's also important to remember that their systems are not all explained by simplification. It could be just rearrangement of data, but it not necessarily simplify things. And so the 3 patterns which I proposed here have to do with emergence of regular patterns, the importance of perceptually salient elements. We saw that in the comparison of a personal and the Romanian pe. We also saw that in tracheic feet, where the syllable stress is very, very important, and the minimization of structural domains. So just to kind of conclude, the overarching value of endangered and heritage languages is not just because they're interesting as an unusual pattern of bilingualism, but because they can help us see vulnerable aspects of grammar. And as we see those aspects, we can become better scientists in understanding how language changes in monolinguals and how children learn, because that's another way these languages are extremely valuable. Thank you very much.